A dentist walked into the White House and pitched a plan to end World War II using bats. Real bats, thousands of them, strapped with tiny bombs. And the craziest part? The US government said yes. This wasn't a joke or a one-off meeting that got laughed out of the room. It became a fully funded, top-secret military program. It had a name, it had teams of scientists, it had military backing from the highest levels, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And for a brief, bizarre moment in American history, the outcome of the deadliest war on Earth depended on whether someone could weaponize a swarm of flying mammals. The plan was codenamed Project X-Ray, and it didn't start with generals or scientists. It started with a civilian. Lytle S. Adams was a Pennsylvania dentist who had just returned from a trip to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, home to one of the largest bat populations in the world. And while watching thousands of them swarm from the caves at sunset, an idea formed, a dark, chaotic idea that kept swirling in his mind like the bats themselves. A month later, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adams sat down and wrote a letter directly to President Roosevelt. He proposed turning bats into living incendiary devices. His reasoning was simple. Japanese cities were largely constructed from wood and paper. Entire neighborhoods could catch fire from a single spark. If the US could get thousands of bats into those buildings, each carrying a timed incendiary, they could cause mass destruction without using a single soldier. It sounded insane, but Roosevelt passed the letter on. Military planners were already drowning in experimental ideas, everything from pigeon-guided missiles to bombs packed with live rodents. In that climate, Adams's plan didn't seem as far-fetched as it might today. So the military said, "Prove it." And he tried. The first step was testing whether bats could actually carry small payloads. They could. Adams and his team discovered that the Mexican free-tailed bat, weighing around 15 grams, could fly with a tiny 15 to 20 gram incendiary without losing altitude. The payloads were designed by one of America's top chemical weapons labs, the National Defense Research Committee. These weren't just firecrackers. The bombs were small cylinders filled with napalm gel, timed to ignite after the bat had had a chance to roost inside buildings. The vision was terrifyingly specific. Drop the bats at dawn, let them scatter and find hiding spots in eaves, attics and rafters. When the timers went off, the city would erupt in hundreds of simultaneous fires from the inside out. By 1943, Project X-Ray had full military support. The Army Air Forces brought in scientists from the California Institute of Technology and even the founder of the Kellogg Company. Yes, the cereal magnate, to help coordinate logistics. The idea was no longer a theory. It was now a classified operation with real deadlines, funding, and field tests. To launch the bats, they designed a special canister, a refrigerated bomb-shaped casing that would hold 1,000 bats in stacked trays. Once dropped from a bomber, the casing would deploy a parachute, then open mid-air, releasing the bats to fly out in every direction. It was a technical nightmare. The bats had to be cooled into hibernation so they wouldn't fly around prematurely, then warmed up just enough to wake up mid-drop. If the temperature was off by a few degrees, the bats either wouldn't wake up at all, or they would wake up too early and start chewing their way out of the bomb while it was still in the aircraft. And that happened multiple times. In one test at the Carlsbad Army Airfield, the bats woke early, escaped, and roosted inside nearby hangars, which were made of wood. Minutes later, the timers went off. Several buildings were set on fire. The damage was accidental but undeniable. The bats did what they were designed to do, just not in the right place. Instead of cancelling the project, the military doubled down. The team relocated testing to Muroc Army Airfield in California, which is now known as Edwards Air Force Base. There, in isolated desert conditions, they began running structured drops with live payloads. The results were startling. In one test simulation, the bats successfully ignited mock-ups of Japanese homes faster and more efficiently than conventional bombs. The US Navy, which had initially dismissed the idea, suddenly wanted in. The program was transferred from the Army Air Forces to the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, and now they were preparing for full-scale deployment. But the clock was ticking. The war in the Pacific was accelerating, and across the country, another experimental weapon was being developed in parallel, one far more powerful than anything involving bats or fire. It was being built in total secrecy in Los Alamos, and it was nearly ready: the atomic bomb. Project X-ray had results, but it had delays too. Designing the canisters, managing the bat's biology, coordinating logistics, it all took time. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project was surging ahead with unlimited funding and top scientific minds. The moment Oppenheimer's team reached critical mass, every other unconventional program started looking slow and redundant. In March 1944, the Navy decided to suspend Project X-ray, not because it had failed. In fact, reports noted it was very promising, but because they believed it wouldn't be operational until mid-1945 at the earliest. By then, military command believed the atomic bomb would be ready. And they were right. The bat bombs were never deployed. They never flew over Tokyo, never roosted in Kyoto, never scorched Osaka. But they could have. The US had spent over 2 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and countless man-hours trying to turn bats into incendiary weapons. And if the Manhattan Project had failed, if the bomb had fizzled or diplomacy had stalled, those tiny flying firebombs might have been the next option. When Project X-ray was officially shut down in 1944, it wasn't because it was a failure. In fact, internal Navy documents described it as an effective weapon with great potential if further developed. But compared to what was coming, atomic fire from 30,000 feet, it suddenly seemed slow, messy, and unpredictable. You could control a bomb. You couldn't control a swarm of bats mid-flight. Still, the project had left a trail. Dozens of field reports, design schematics, prototype canisters, and even footage of the bat drops. Some of it was archived, most of it was quietly buried, and for decades the public had no idea any of this had happened. It wasn't until the 1990s, through a combination of declassified documents and Freedom of Information Act requests, that the full picture emerged. Journalists, military historians, and amateur researchers started piecing together the bizarre reality of Project X-ray. Interviews with aging scientists confirmed what the paperwork's already hinted at. The program had been deadly serious and surprisingly effective. Lytle Adams, the dentist who started it all, spent the rest of his life telling the story. He believed his invention could have ended the war without the atomic bomb. According to him, fire bats would have destroyed the most flammable parts of Japan's infrastructure, sparked panic, and brought the war to a halt without nuclear fallout. But no one in power was listening anymore. The bat bomb became a footnote, a punchline in military history books. It would occasionally show up in TV documentaries or trivia columns, usually framed as a "can you believe this" moment. But here's the part people forget. The basic logic behind the idea wasn't wrong. In March 1945, just months after the Bat Project was shelved, the US launched a massive firebombing campaign over Tokyo. Using B-29 bombers and napalm-based cluster bombs, they targeted the wooden residential areas of the city. The result was devastating. The fires spread faster than predicted. Over 100,000 people were killed in a single night. It was more lethal than either atomic bomb dropped later that year. What Adams had proposed with bats, targeted, low-altitude incendiary attacks, was ultimately carried out on a larger, more brutal scale. The only difference was that the bats were alive and the bombs that replaced them weren't. As crazy as Project X-ray sounds, it tapped into something military planners understood very clearly. Japan's architecture was vulnerable to fire. It wasn't about killing soldiers. It was about crippling logistics, manufacturing, and morale by turning cities into kindling. But Project X-ray wasn't just a military story. It was a science story. It forced teams of biologists, chemists, and engineers to work together on something completely unprecedented: the controlled deployment of living creatures as precision weapons. And they pulled it off. The delivery system worked. The bat behavior was predictable. The fires started right on schedule. The only reason you've never heard about it is because something worse got greenlit. If the Manhattan Project hadn't delivered the atomic bomb on time, those bats would have been flying. Years later, modern analysts revisited the case as part of a study into unconventional warfare platforms. The conclusion? It would be illegal today. Current Geneva Conventions and animal welfare laws prohibit the weaponization of living creatures in this way. But in the 1940s, there were no such rules. Wartime desperation blurred every line. There's no monument to Project X-ray, no plaque, no military base named after Adams, just scattered documents, faded photographs, and a few eyewitness accounts from scientists who once strapped explosives to living things, and almost changed the course of history doing it. In a war that gave us Hiroshima, D-Day, kamikaze pilots, and the Holocaust, a story about bat bombs feels surreal. But it's real, it happened, and it nearly became one of the most unusual weapons ever deployed by the United States. Not because it was a joke, but because it worked. And the only reason it didn't go further was because something far more destructive beat it to the battlefield.